In this video, we will show you how to replace your front wheel bearing on this Honda Accord. This will be located behind your front wheel. A quick note, it's also a good idea to replace your wheel hub at the same time. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle with the wheels off the ground and the suspension hanging. Once you've done so, continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Once the wheel's out of the way, we'll be removing the 32mm axle nut. If you find when you're trying to turn this counterclockwise to remove it, this wants to rotate, you can either step on the brake, holding it still, or put a pry bar coming down diagonally in between the lug studs, being careful not to damage them. We'll use a hammer and punch right in the center of the axle to break this free. Once you have movement in this area, you can continue on. Move along to your outer tie rod end. You should find that you have a locking cotter pin holding your nut in place. Remove the cotter pin and remove the nut. Use a 17mm for this. Once you've inspected the nut, put it back on there, just a couple threads. We'll continue on with a hammer. Cause some vibration on the steering knuckle, being extremely careful not to damage your tie rod end or the boot. Inspect your tie rod end and set it aside. Now we can remove the ABS sensor from the knuckle. You'll find that you have one 10mm headed bolt holding this in place. Out of there. Quick inspection of the bolt. The next thing you'll want to do is start removing the sensor from inside of the knuckle. It's common for this to be stuck in place. If it is, go ahead and use some penetrant and try to tap this a little bit side to side just to break it free. But be careful not to damage the ABS sensor. All right, let's get a little bit of movement here. Slide that right out of there. We'll give it a close inspection. If it looks like it's cracked or damaged in any way, you want to make sure you replace the sensor or else you will have an ABS light. Now we can follow the ABS sensor wire up to its mounting point right across the rear of the steering knuckle. Use a 10mm to remove the bolt. Take the ABS wire and sensor and tuck it up and out of the way so it will not get damaged. Let's move away from the ABS wire and move to the brake flex hose. You'll find that this is held in place to the steering knuckle with 2 10mm headed bolts. We'll remove the pair. Separate the flex hose from the knuckle. With that dislodged, follow the brake hose down to the caliper. You'll be finding that you have 2 17mm bolts that hold your caliper bracket to the steering knuckle. Remove the pair. We'll start with the top, fully remove it, a quick inspection, and start it back in just a couple threads. Now we'll fully remove the lower bolt, take hold of the caliper, and remove that final bolt. Slide your caliper off of your brake rotor. Once you have it off of there, it's a good idea to inspect those brake pads. If they need to be replaced, now's a perfect time to do a brake job. Let's set this aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose. There we are. Now we can move along to removing the brake rotor. To do that, install one of your lug nuts. We only need to put it on here a couple threads. This is for safety. To remove the brake rotor, you'll find that you have 2 Phillips head screws to remove. This will be easiest using a bit driver. Put that on there, turn this counterclockwise while applying pressure. I'll give it a loving tap with my hammer. are. Remove your brake rotor. We'll give this a quick inspection and set it aside. Make your way to where the lower ball joint connects to your lower control arm. We'll remove this nut by first removing the locking cotter pin. Let's get that right out of here. It's pretty common for these to break off. Use a 17mm to remove the mounting nut. Now we can start separating the ball joint from the lower control arm. To do this, you want to try to use a ball joint removal tool, so you can gently press up on the stud and push it up and out of the control arm. If you don't have one of those, you could use a hammer and just give the lower control arm a couple taps. We're trying to cause vibration, so this will break free. While doing so, I'm going to lift up on the knuckle a little bit, applying pressure. There we are. Now that that's broken free, let's move to our upper ball joint. For the upper ball joint, commonly you will have a cotter pin holding it in place, so we'll just go ahead and remove that. Use a 17mm to remove the nut. Start the nut on there a couple threads. Now we'll separate the ball joint from the upper portion of the steering knuckle. Once again, a couple loving bonks with a hammer will cause vibration and it should want to separate. The nut is going to prevent that from falling down and potentially hurting you. Take hold of the control arm, gently push it down towards that knuckle. Remove the nut. At this point, we'll start bringing up the control arm. Pivot the knuckle down. While doing so, pay attention to the axle. That has to push out through the inboard side of the wheel bearing. There we are. Now we'll continue on by lifting the lower ball joint up and out of the lower control arm and then fully removing this from the axle. Over on the bench, we'll continue on with some penetrant along the back side of that steering knuckle. Looking in this area, you'll find that you have a small tin that you will have to remove. You can use a flat blade screwdriver for this. Just try to get underneath the lip and gently pry it out of place. Give that a quick inspection. Make sure it is still reusable. Go ahead and clean it up and set it aside. Now let's get the knuckle over to the press. It's important to make sure that you're securing the knuckle in a way that you will be able to press the hub down and out. I'll show you my setup here. I have this sitting on a spacer. So the two ears where the caliper bracket would go are sitting up on top here. On the far end, we have the area where the outer tie rod end would go. I have a spacer under that as well. I'm trying to hold this as flat and level as possible. We'll continue on by removing the center area here, pressing it down and out. That's the hub. We're removing it from the bearing. When you do so, you will destroy the bearing. I'll use a 34mm socket. That goes right over the area of the hub so we can press it down and out. A small spacer. And now we'll start applying pressure. Be extremely careful in this area while you do so. Now we can set this aside. Once you have the hub out of the bearing, we're going to pay attention along the forward side of it. It's time to remove the snap ring from this area. To do that, we'll be using some snap ring pliers. Get inside of each of these 2 holes, squeeze them together, and remove the snap ring from this area. You can see it starting to separate there. If you have a hard time, you can try tapping on it with a chisel if you had to. Just make my way in here with a screwdriver and gently pry it out of place. Keep in mind this is under spring tension. We'll clean this up and give it a close inspection. Make sure it is still reusable. Go ahead and set that aside. Let's start pressing the rest of the bearing out of the knuckle. Once again, we have the knuckle being held in place as level as possible with the ground. We'll use a spacer that'll fit directly onto that bearing but won't get stuck inside of the knuckle. Once you've done so, you can continue on with pressing that right down and out. Let's give that a quick inspection. You always want to make sure you clean up this area. Make sure it's not rusted or rotted, especially where the locking C-clip will go. Now we can install our bearing. When you look at this bearing, you'll find that each side is a little bit different than the other. The outboard side will have a seal. The inboard side has a magnet. We'll make sure we have the magnet side facing towards the inboard side of the steering knuckle. Now when we go to press this down into the knuckle, it's important to only press this down by the outer portion of the bearing. Never press by the inside portion, or especially along that seal. It's going to cause damage, and you'll have to replace the bearing again. To do that, I'll just use my original bearing race, put it right along the top there. Now we'll apply pressure, making sure we're going straight down. If it starts getting a little off kilter, we'll pause, readjust, and continue until it's completely bottomed out. And then we can put on our snap ring. Now right there I put a lot of pressure on this. I'll leave pressure on, use a hammer, and just cause a little bit of vibration along this area. Inspect the area. Confirm you cause no damage to the bearing or to the seal. Once you've done so, continue on with that snap ring. We'll put that right back in place, then we'll continue on reinstalling our hub. Let's install that snap ring. Put it on the pliers, carefully squeeze it together. We'll slide this right into place. Confirm it's seated all the way around. Perfect. On the original hub, you'll find that you still have the outboard race to your wheel bearing on this area. It's a little bit difficult to remove this. You can use a torch and try to cut it, or some sort of cutting wheel. Just be extremely careful not to damage it. I always recommend replacing these at the same time as the bearing. Let's take that hub and we'll put the center of it on a spacer so we can be sure we will not damage the lug studs. Continue on by putting the knuckle and the wheel bearing directly over this area. We will have to press it down and into position. Now that we have this up on here, we're going to pay attention to the inboard race on the wheel bearing. That's where we will have to apply pressure. So we'll use a race that fits directly over that. You can use any kind of spacer really. Put this right up on here. Confirm that everything's as even and straight as possible. Now we can start applying pressure. As we do so, we're also going to be turning the knuckle a little bit, just to ensure that the bearing is not binding. All right, let's start pressing it on. Right there I heard an audible difference in the press itself. I can also feel that there's more pressure as I'm trying to drive this together. Once again, we'll use a hammer, cause a little bit of vibration along this area, being extremely careful not to damage the backing plate. One more quick squeeze just to make sure we're completely bottomed out. Release pressure and give it a good inspection. Now we can take hold of that knuckle and let's get back over to the bench. Over on the bench, we'll be paying attention to this ring. Looking at it, you can see that you have a small notch cut out of it. That's important to note because when you're putting this in place, it needs to align with where the ABS sensor would go through the knuckle. Let's get this aligned and start driving it down and into place. You can use a hammer, maybe a little punch. Confirm it's seated all the way around, and let's get this back over to the vehicle. Let's continue on to applying a little bit of anti-seize along the splined area of the axle, not necessarily the threaded area. Now we can install the knuckle. As we do so, we need to take the axle and put it through the backside of the wheel bearing. At the same time as doing that, we'll put the lower ball joint into the lower control arm. Start on your lower ball joint nut by hand, snug it up, and then torque it to 65 foot-pounds. The next thing you'll want to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the ball joint stud. If it's not aligned, you need to continue tightening the nut until the very next slot is. After that, put in your locking cotter pin. Slide that cotter pin through and peen it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Move along to resecuring your upper ball joint to the knuckle. Start the nut on there, snug it up, and torque it to 35 foot-pounds. After that, go ahead and put in your locking cotter pin. The next thing you'll want to do, if you are not replacing the hub, is to make sure you clean up the mating surface where your rotor will sit. Ours is brand new, so we'll move along to the back side of the rotor. Along the back side of the rotor, you want to make sure you clean up the mating surface. You can use some sandpaper or a sanding disc. Apply some copper anti-seize to the mating surface on your hub. Now we can install the brake rotor. When doing so, you want to pay attention to where the lug holes are and to where each one of your little mounting holes are for those Phillips head screws. I can see everything I need here. We'll continue on with a lug nut to hold the rotor in place. Start in the mounting screws and then we'll snug them up. Can remove that lug nut, set it aside. Let's take that caliper and slide it into place. Before we put in the mounting bolts, pay attention to your flex hose. You want to ensure that that caliper did not twist the flex hose in any way. The bracket should align properly, that looks good. We'll pause on the flex hose and continue on with our 2 caliper bracket bolts. Start them in by hand, snug them up, and torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Let's apply some copper anti-seize to that knuckle. Once you've done so, we'll continue on with putting the bracket in the proper placement, start in your 2 10mm headed bolts, and snug them up. The torque for these is 7.2 foot-pounds. On the other side of the knuckle, let's continue on with our ABS sensor. We'll take this and slide it into place. Align the mounting bolt hole and start in that 10mm headed bolt. Once you have it started in, torque that to 7.2 foot-pounds as well. Once you have the bottom of the ABS sensor in place, we'll also put it into the mounting bracket along the knuckle. When you're doing so, you want to align the mounting bolt hole along the top and then also the alignment tab in the bottom hole there. We'll press that right into place and snug it up. The torque for this is also 7.2 foot-pounds. Confirm that your ABS wire is secured properly and it's not twisted in any way. You also want to make sure it's not going to hit up against anything where it could potentially get damaged. Time to reinstall our outer tie rod end. Slide it right on through there from the top towards the bottom, snug the nut, and then torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued to 32 foot-pounds, continue on with your locking cotter pin, slide it right on through the hole, and pin it over. Now let's continue on with the axle nut. We'll start this on by hand, and then you always want to make sure you snug it up with your ratchet. Never use an impact tool on this because you could damage the bearing. Once you have it bottomed out, it's going to be time to torque this to 134 foot-pounds. To torque this, you will find that it's going to want to spin on you. So what you'll have to do is either have a second person holding on the brake pedal, or you can just use a pry bar coming down across those studs. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure you have it in an angle that it's not going to cause any damage to the threads. Once you've done that, you're going to want to pay attention to the small slot on the axle. We have to use a hammer and punch and drive the very edge of the nut down into that slot. That'll lock it into this position. There we are. Now we can put on the wheel. Once you have that in place, continue on with your 19mm lug nuts. We'll start them in, bottom them out, get the wheel safely back on the ground. Once we've done that, we can torque these to 80 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we've got our vehicle back together. At this point, hop inside the passenger compartment and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After you've done that, take your vehicle for a road test, listen for funny noises, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.